On the last episode of the Keepsake box. Truthfully, I had no desire to intermingle myself with the wiles of Antonio's illegal life. I agreed to his request to make him feel better, but I knew that I didn't belong there. In fact, I suggested that he pause his drug business until he was released. Antonio laughed while addressing my request. "This isn't a movie, little girl. You can't just pause it." He told me that it didn't work that way. There were people above and below him, and he couldn't just bow out. He told me that people got killed when expectations weren't met. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Even with doing everything the right way, anything could happen, and I was thinking about changing everything. I was again presented with the thought of Antonio getting killed in prison as a result of me dropping the ball. I couldn't face that. I knew I would have to dig deep. Antonio sensed my apprehension and made me feel better. "You can do this, little girl. You're stronger than you think." He always knew exactly what to say. The way Antonio explained things made them seem very simple. I never had to touch or even see the drugs. All I had to do was talk, make deals, pay money, and collect money. It seemed simple enough, and his breakdown made me feel slightly better. Antonio said that he would introduce me to everyone that I needed to know and give me the rundown on exactly how everything was to go. I was scared. Other than tweaking the books, I hadn't really done anything illegal. Definitely not anything on that level. But I didn't want to let Antonio down. I didn't want him to feel that he couldn't depend on me. I attempted to put my worries aside and take in everything that he told me. I had to make it work. Many people will wonder why I agreed to take on such an extreme undertaking. Most people wouldn't just agree to become a drug dealer, especially not on such a large scale. But you have to understand something. Antonio had been good to me. According to my perspective at the time, he supplied my wants, needs, and deepest desires. He provided some things that I didn't even know I wanted or needed and hadn't ever really expected anything from me. Additionally, I couldn't discredit the fact that I had been more than willing to spend every dime that Antonio accumulated from said drug business. Those were my thoughts at the time. That's what made it easier for me to cross that line. Antonio made the introductions and let it be known that everyone was to handle things just as they would if they were dealing with him. I could tell the guys respected Antonio. That helped me to feel a little more comfortable. Maybe the respect that they had for Antonio would spill over to me. Deep down, I felt that it would. Antonio wouldn't put me in danger. He loved me too much. So I took in everything and prepared to take on my new role. Like I said, there was no turning back. I promised Antonio that he could leave it all in my hands and I wouldn't make him regret it. I agreed to everything that was asked of me. As it turns out, we would both end up regretting that to an immeasurable degree. Chapter 14, Handling Business. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Antonio brought Peaches in to help me with the drug business. She knew the process like the back of her hand, and Antonio knew that. And even though I had taken what should have been hers several times over, Peaches agreed to help me with no questions or resistance. Antonio explained the situation to Peaches and told her that he expected her to do for me what she would have done for him, and she agreed. Outside of her presence, Antonio issued a stern warning. "Remember," he said, "Peaches is a shrimp. You have to domesticate her. You have to control what she eats." I took it all in, but I have to be honest. I didn't understand the partnership between Antonio and Peaches. They certainly didn't have a clownfish and anemone relationship. It seemed to be more like a killer whale and a sardine. It didn't seem that she was getting anything out of dealing with Antonio, which was strange. He was very generous. I assumed that she was getting some money from him, but it obviously hadn't been enough to improve her lifestyle. Peaches was living in the same apartment, driving the same car, and working the same job as the day I met her. It seemed that she had every reason to walk away, yet she didn't. I wonder why she never felt that she could do better. But in the moment, I was glad that she didn't. I felt more comfortable knowing that I would have someone familiar on my side, even if she was the shrimp. 2 weeks passed before Antonio's recklessness caught up with him. Antonio and I went out to see a movie. In typical Antonio fashion, he took me to a movie that made me think a little too much. He chose to take me to see the movie Blow. Leave it to Antonio to take me to a movie about the rise and fall of a drug kingpin. After leaving the movie, Antonio was pulled over for not using his turn signal. Of all things, not using a turn signal. I hated that my time with Antonio had been cut short. I wanted as much time with him as I could possibly have. I was sad, but I knew the day would come. He knew it as well. Antonio told me that he loved me and he trusted me with his life. The last thing he said to me was, "Don't let the life swallow you up, little girl." Then he went away. Just like that, he was gone. Antonio was scheduled for a bond hearing a week later. The judge set his bail, and it would cost $5,000 to get him out. Antonio had $5,000 many times over, and I was fully prepared to pay it. I thought Antonio would jump at the opportunity to get out of jail, but he instructed me to save the money. He said he would just wait it out until it was time for him to go to court. A part of me was devastated. I wanted every single second that I could have with him, but the other part of me was impressed. Antonio was willing to stay in jail to make sure that he left me with as much money as possible. He told me that he would rather stay inside than to pull anything from what should have been left to me. That's love, I thought. I loved the way he loved me. Waiting was the hardest part. I missed Antonio, but I was more worried about what was going to happen in the future. I didn't have to handle Antonio's business until he was officially away, and I was on pins and needles waiting the time out. Even though I was terrified, I needed for it to be over either way. It's crazy how perspective on time changes. My entire relationship with Antonio seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, but waiting for his court date seemed to take forever. I guess it's true what they say. Time flies when you're having fun. When it was all said and done, the judge gave Antonio 3 years for his probation violation. Although I was saddened that he had received that much time, I was relieved that we had some finality. I was relieved that the wait was over. All we had to do was count down until his release. Antonio receiving his time did, however, solidify my position. Everything was handed over to me on the day that he was sentenced. I didn't have anyone else to depend on. I had to handle business, legitimate and otherwise. Peaches was a godsend in the first few weeks. As I said before, she knew the business like the back of her hand. She knew how to look the part, and she made me look credible. I got the hang of things pretty quickly. Antonio was right. All I had to do was talk, make deals, pay money, and collect money. The minute details took care of themselves. I knew what was happening, and I knew who was making it happen. I didn't bother with the details, and everything worked out just as Antonio said it would. True to his word, Antonio had set everything up perfectly. I fired Antonio's girls from the other businesses and took over the day-to-day operations. I did them a solid, however. I gave them a small severance package. It was certainly more than they deserved, and more than they would have gotten in any other situation. They hated me, and I didn't care much for them either. Under any other set of circumstances, they would have walked away with nothing. I only looked out for them because I remembered being broke and trying to figure it all out. In spite of my dislike for them, I had no desire to create a situation of struggle for them, but they had to go. I no longer had a place for them. I dug deep into their keeping of the businesses. The other girls definitely weren't as sharp as I was, and after seeing their handiwork, I was even happier that I had fired them. I didn't understand how the businesses had sustained as long as they did. I made sure that everything was up to par, though. I wanted to make sure that Antonio would be happy with what he came home to. I did exactly what I felt was owed to Antonio. I took care of his business, visited weekly, and sent him money. I respected him in the same way that I did when he was home. A few of the guys expressed an interest in something romantic, but I was sure to shut it down. Most of them were Antonio's goons. They were the help. I made sure they respected me, and I made sure they respected Antonio. I promised Antonio that I wouldn't do anything that would have him looking crazy in the streets, a promise that I took very seriously. I kept Antonio informed about everything, and I even looked out for Cream and Peaches in the same way that he did. I couldn't believe how easy it was. The money came in fast and hard. And while I had initially felt indebted to Antonio, a couple of things started to change by month 2. For the first time, I understood how Antonio was able to afford 4 girlfriends. The money was rolling in faster than I could keep up with. Also, for the first time, I started to feel shortchanged by Antonio. I saw what he was pulling in versus what he was putting out. I felt that Antonio could have invested more into me, a thought that weighed heavily upon me. While I was doing the math on how I was going to afford a college education, Antonio could have paid my tuition multiple times over. I thought about the fact that he had gotten my breasts done, but he hadn't volunteered to help when I had to replace my roof due to a leak. I started to question my position in Antonio's value system. It wasn't necessarily where I felt that bothered me. My issue was why I was in that place. In my mind, the answer was fairly simple. Antonio did things for me that made him look good. I was his trophy. The idea of me looked good. I was young, pretty, and I spoke well. I owned my own house. I wasn't hood like Cream and Peaches. I didn't do drugs. I wasn't a shrimp. I wasn't a prude like Sharon. I was sexually adventurous. I was smart. I worked the books. I made Antonio look good. Don't get me wrong. I acknowledge where I benefited in the situation. Antonio had done a lot for me, and he was exactly what I wanted and needed at the time. When I started dealing with him, I was fresh out of my situation with Ken. Antonio was a breath of fresh air because he exposed me to different things. Ken was a young boy, and I was impressed by the prospect of being with a man. Antonio showed me bigger and better things. He showed me what I felt were the finer things and elevated me sexually. I wasn't in denial about his contributions in my life. But at the same time, I was aware that Antonio did a lot for me that was for his benefit as well. I wondered if he had ever done anything solely for my benefit. Yet there I was. I was 21 years old, an academic scholar, raised in church and selling drugs. I hadn't come to that point on my own accord. I was living that life because Antonio needed me to. Antonio needed me to. I was risking my life and my freedom because of a misguided loyalty to him. Again, I was back and forth about the whole thing. I was sure that I wouldn't have chosen that life for myself. But I have to be honest. I loved the money, and I loved being in charge. I loved making moves and knowing that others would follow my lead. I loved the life. I had always allowed the men in my life to make the decisions, even though I would have been much better off if I had gone my own way. Antonio's incarceration gave me a renewed sense of belief in myself and my abilities. I still loved Antonio. I handled his business, visited, and sent money. I didn't do anything that would make him look crazy in the streets. However, I set things up to be a little bit more beneficial to me. That was only fair. Many people might say I stole from Antonio, but I didn't look at it that way. I simply made things fair. Prior to Antonio's incarceration, he incurred the risk, and he reaped the rewards. He gave me what he wanted me to have. Now, being the person who is at risk, I felt slighted by only taking what Antonio wanted me to have. Antonio had all the finer things in life. Why shouldn't I also have those things? Why should I only give myself what would allow Antonio to look good? So it was settled. I worked the books and took a little off the top. I fixed up Grandma's house and made sure I looked the part. Antonio was none the wiser. After 6 months, I no longer had to alter the books. All of the income in the main accounts was legitimately from business operations. There were tangible worksheets that explained what was coming in and what was going out. Each business also had a sub-account which actually held the proceeds from the drug business. Every so often, I would make deposits into the sub-accounts and relate the proceeds to an actual event. For instance, I would receive $25,000 from the drug sales. The next week, I would throw an event at the club and anticipate a large crowd. All money from the actual event would be deposited into the main account. The $25,000 would be deposited into the sub-account as if it were income from the event. It was perfect, and it worked. It probably would have worked for the entire time that Antonio was away. But I guess I got too big for my britches, as Grandma would say. Antonio had set everything up for me. But of course, I wanted more. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.